By giving the objects stats, I can now obtain a uniform metric with which to compare different tasks and understand how they compare to each other in a clear and concise way, whilst having the characteristics of one being an apple and one being an orange. For example, imagine a scenario on Runescape. I can pick one full inventory of flax, decide how long it takes me to do the single inventory and how much that is worth, and then I can calculate a model that projects how much you will gain if you do that for 1 hour's time. That number is relatively static. It of course is fluctuating with the flax's price in the GE and other market factors, but essentially I know that I can generally generate a very rough or very baseline level around that figure. So if flax is 100 GP each and it takes me 5 minutes to bank one inventory, and it takes 37 inventories to pick 1,000, which is 1,000K, which is 100K and takes X amount of time, or 37 times the baseline run. I can figure out what that task brings per hour just by doing a small sample. Now I can take another task such as employing my time at Barrows, for example, which is an extremely that's a night and day comparison compared to picking flax. It's highly volatile, highly dependent on luck. It's not averaged at all. There's no clear way to define any scenario of a stable, concise metric to use to compare to the flax example. However, by doing various runs of Barrows over time and tracking the average that you're making over time as a running average, you can forever be moving towards what is the perfect model of stabilizing that and defining it in a way such that it compares to picking flax. So if I do Barrows for a week and determine that that weekly average is roughly 500K per hour, I can use that to now compare to flax, which is roughly 100K per hour, right? And so now I have a ratio between these two tasks that is clearly and concisely communicated to which one is more efficient and more worthwhile in terms of what's worth spending your time on, because you don't know initially. Because not only do you not know initially what a task is going to be worth in the end, or will otherwise accumulate to in the reaping of its fruits, even when you do find out, you do not have an established baseline comparison to know if that's good or bad. Essentially, we're finding the best returns on time spent and then maximizing those frequencies of engagement purposefully and optimizing that. This doesn't seem too significant right now to have, but once you have 100 different tasks accumulated, you now have a very robust way to determine if something is not even worth continuing engagement in because of its smaller return on value in the long run. And simultaneously, if there is room in your schedule, given that you already have 100 of these defined, it can still be added until something pushes a full schedule of inputs out of the rotation by deeming something else weaker. In economic terms, we are defining things in terms of opportunity cost and then throwing out ones that prove less efficient. Same manner, I can do small samples of real-world tasks, establish a baseline, and use that baseline as a model of, say, picking flax, a static, non-changing initial projection of worth per hour or second in terms of bringing in value or generating value. That ratio, when you're comparing two tasks or two scenarios or two engagements of time, or essentially what you're spending your focus and attention on, when you compare two separate processes or tasks or endeavors or whatever, it is infinitely complex or basically unsolvable. But the goal is to simply capture as many initializations or as many baselines as possible, as fast as possible, and start working towards adding to those over time, or making those more efficient over time, or coming up with methods to achieve better results, or project different scenarios, etc., etc. For example, you could collect cans, collect scrap metal, cut grass, car detailing, hair cutting, etc., etc. How do you quantify and how do you establish a clear and concise hierarchy between every single one of these tasks, which makes them directly comparable to each other in terms of what's worth more per second of time engaging in that? And so, in actuality, this is an infinitely changing, never solvable calculation or figure whatsoever. It's completely infinitely complex, obviously, just like something like, say, the stock market. But when you start building data models over time, taking those averaged results and constantly building a more concise data picture, you're able to narrow down, infinitely increasing towards what would be considered the closest approximation to whatever conceivable perfection that could eventually exist if the world were perfect, right? So it's one huge forever played game of woulda, coulda, shoulda, in which you will seldom lose at first and theoretically never lose towards the end of that timeline. That is the goal of the game. So that's probably my best way at stripping every other facet and getting down to core game logic. Just to give a cap or summary of what this does, by generating stats to real objects and then pairing that with the classification of the timings or return values of processes, eventually and a computer system can tell a person what is imagine this scenario. You're at McDonald's and you work a minimum wage job. What skills should you invest in? Do you pick up woodworking? Do you recycle cans? Do you start building a bamboo house out of mud and bricks? Do you what do you do? What is going to pay you the long-term benefit in the shortest amount of time? Basically, what the game does is, once played, it will be able to automatically tell you what is the best course of action to achieve the greatest amount of return value with the least amount of input time. So, for example, in a So for example, once a person has established enough of a model to make significant and clear, concise predictions on outcomes and what's the best way to say this, babe? How do you say what? Okay. Do you stay at your dead-end job, or do you learn a skill on your off time in order to prepare yourself to move away from that job? The obvious answer is yes. But how do you know which skill will pay the most amount of money and therefore what you should learn to do? You don't, right? That's an impossible question, right? So what would you do? What pick a skill. Just
Well, if I have a like really my passion, then that's where
so
I
what's
choose.
so what is that?
Like me, I love cooking, so I'm going to my passion and then
Okay, so you love
practice my skills and then
Okay, so
plan for a business or
you love cooking, right? Okay. Now let's consider all of the options of cooking. You can bake cookies, you can do baked goods, cakes, decorative cakes, etc. You can do catering, you can open a barbecue shop, you can cook gourmet steaks, you can open up a smoothie shop. There's a bunch of different scenarios, right? That you could do. And if you were a millionaire, you maybe could do 3 to 5 of these and then offload some of that work. Right, you can franchise. So now, what this system would do for you is it would tell you, given $0, you have, because you're poor, right? You only have $10. It's gonna tell you step by step in what order is best to buy what tool in order to do what sort of task that will bring you the most amount of money fastest, so that you may grow the fastest towards reaching the end result of the perfection of all of that, which is owning 10 different cooking gourmet businesses, you know? So it's really hard to explain how it would do that, but basically it's predicting how much every tool you buy, every little knife, every cutting board, it will determine how much those are worth relative to one another. So by putting those in a hierarchy, it's telling you the most efficient way and the most efficient order to buy those tools from the least to the most. So, and for clarification, I don't mean least and most in terms of the cost of each item monetarily, rather the cost and time cost added together into a one metric comparison relative to the totality. You know, Gordon Ramsay, he has probably 10,000 different cooking tools, right? So if you want to replicate Gordon Ramsay and buy every one of the tools he has, it's going to tell you the absolute best order in which to purchase all of those. And in doing so, it's getting you to your desired outcome the fastest. And that is increasing over exponential as time goes on. And that is crazy to do. That is borderline impossible. But it's really not, because that's programming and that's math and that's the power of it.